Some people find each other in crowded rooms. Others find each other in the space between words that no one else can see. Mike Burton couldn't sleep. Again. The penthouse walls pressed in like they were slowly exhaling, squeezing the air from rooms that cost more than most people earned in lifetimes. He'd tried everything. Hot showers that scalded his skin pink, whiskey that burned tracks down his throat, counting backwards from 1,000 until the numbers blurred into meaningless sounds. Nothing worked. Sleep had become something other people did, a luxury he'd traded for consciousness he didn't want. At 2 in the morning, he gave up pretending. He made coffee that would taste like punishment and opened his laptop, scrolling past emails from lawyers, messages from his assistant about meetings he dreaded, headlines about markets he no longer cared about. His finger hovered over the browser, and on impulse he typed "poetry forum" into the search bar. He didn't know why. He hadn't read poetry since college, hadn't thought about art or beauty or anything that didn't have a profit margin attached to it. The forum was simple, almost primitive, compared to the sleek interfaces he navigated daily. Just words on a pale background, usernames without faces, thoughts without performance. He scrolled through poems that tried too hard, through verses that rhymed because the writers thought poetry required it, through confessional pieces that felt more like therapy than art. Then he found it, a poem titled "Gravity Without Ground." They tell you falling requires somewhere to land, that descent demands a bottom, that loss needs an ending. But I've been falling for years now, and the ground keeps moving, and the landing never comes, and I've learned that falling is just another way of saying I'm still here. Mike read it 3 times, then a 4th. Something about the words felt like they'd been written in a language he'd forgotten he knew. He clicked on the username PB Writes. Her profile was sparse, just a collection of poems about resilience that didn't romanticize suffering, about loneliness that didn't beg for pity, about strength that admitted exhaustion without apology. He wrote a comment before he could second-guess himself. "Your metaphor structure is remarkable. You're describing free fall, but the syntax creates this sense of suspension. How do you do that?" He hit post and immediately regretted it. She probably wouldn't respond. Why would she? But he kept the tab open anyway, refreshing it every few minutes while pretending to review contracts that all said the same thing in slightly different ways. 23 minutes later, a notification appeared. B writes, "The syntax mirrors the experience. When you're suspended between what you were and what you might become, language has to live in that in-between space too. What made you notice the structure instead of just the content?" Mike stared at the screen. When was the last time someone asked him a real question? When was the last time anyone cared what he thought beyond what he could provide? He typed, "Because I've been living in that in-between space. I know what it sounds like." Her response came faster this time. "Then you know the sound is different at 2 in the morning." Something shifted in his chest. "It's 2:17 right now, 2:31 here. Insomnia or demons?" "Both. You?" The same. "Want to tell me about yours?" And just like that, they started talking. Not about who they were or where they lived or what they did, but about the shape of their wounds. Mike told her about growing up with a brother who died young and stayed perfect in everyone's memory, how he'd spent his life competing with a ghost that never aged or made mistakes or disappointed anyone. She told him about a father who left on a Tuesday afternoon after watching her win a school poetry competition, how she'd learned that success could be the thing that makes people leave instead of the thing that makes them stay. "Do you still write about family?" Mike asked. "No, some doors close for good reasons. What do you write about instead?" "Everything else. The world is large enough for a lifetime of other subjects." They rode back and forth until the sun came up, and Mike realized he'd missed his alarm. His assistant would be calling soon, asking where he was, why he wasn't answering, whether he needed her to reschedule the morning. He didn't care. "I should go," he typed. "But can we do this again? Tomorrow, same time?" "Tomorrow." That night, Mike was at his laptop at 1:30, waiting. She appeared at 1:45, apologizing for being late, and they fell back into conversation like they'd been doing this for years instead of hours. She asked him about his work, and he told her he built things, kept it vague, talked instead about what it felt like to create something from nothing and watch other people take credit. She understood that. She told him about writing, about submitting her work to people who sent back form rejections that all said the same thing, "Not what we're looking for right now." "How many rejections?" Mike asked. "I stopped counting after the 40th. Counting makes it harder, but you keep submitting. What else am I supposed to do? Stop believing I have something to say?" Mike had never met anyone who kept going after 40 rejections. Everyone he knew quit after 3, maybe 5 if they were stubborn. 40 rejections would have crushed him into dust. "You're stronger than most people," he wrote. "I'm not strong. I'm just too stubborn to know when to quit." They talked about books they loved and books they pretended to love, about movies that made them cry and movies they walked out of, about music that felt like coming home and music that felt like leaving. She told him about her sisters, how she'd helped raise them after her father left, how she still felt responsible for their happiness, even though they were grown now. He told her about his mother, how nothing he did was ever quite enough, how he'd learned to stop trying for approval and started just trying to survive her disappointment. "Does it get easier?" she asked. "The not trying for approval part?" "No, you just get better at pretending it doesn't matter." "That sounds exhausting." "It is." The conversations became ritual. Every night at 2, sometimes earlier if they both couldn't sleep, sometimes later if one of them had a particularly bad day. They started sharing their writing. She sent him poems that made his chest ache. He sent her observations about the world that she said sounded like prose poetry, even though he'd never tried to make them beautiful. "You have an eye for detail," she wrote, after he described the way morning light hit his windows. "You notice things most people miss. Maybe I'm just lonely enough to pay attention. Or maybe you're the kind of person who sees the world clearly, and that's why you're lonely. Most people prefer the blurry version." Mike thought about that for a long time. "Which version do you prefer?" "The clear one. Even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts. Especially then." 6 weeks passed like this. 6 weeks of conversations that felt more real than anything in his physical life. Mike's assistant noticed he was smiling at his phone during meetings. His brother called and said he sounded different, lighter somehow, and asked if he'd started taking those vitamins he'd recommended. Mike didn't tell him about PB rights. He didn't tell anyone. This thing they were building felt too fragile for other people's opinions. She didn't tell anyone either. Her sister Rhonda found her awake at dawn once, still typing, and asked who she was talking to. Pamela said just a friend from the forum, nobody important. But Rhonda saw the way her sister's face changed when a notification appeared, the way she smiled at words on a screen, and Rhonda knew this wasn't nothing. "Be careful," Rhonda said. "Of what?" "Of hope. It's the most dangerous thing." But Pamela was already hoping. She couldn't help it. She'd spent so long believing she'd never connect with someone like this, that her life was too complicated, and her body too broken, and her experiences too different. And here was someone who understood loneliness the way she did, who saw the world with the same clear, painful vision, who made her feel seen in ways she'd forgotten were possible. When Mike finally suggested a phone call, Pamela's hands shook over the keyboard. A call meant voices, and voices meant her breathlessness would be exposed. The slight catch in her words when her lungs didn't cooperate. The sound of her reality leaking through the careful words she constructed. She accepted anyway. The call lasted 7 hours. His voice was deeper than she'd imagined, rough with exhaustion and something else she couldn't quite name. Her voice carried the breathlessness she'd worried about. But he didn't ask, just listened like every word she spoke mattered more than anything else in his world. They talked about everything and nothing, about dreams they'd abandoned and dreams they were too scared to abandon, about the ways life breaks people and the ways some people refuse to stay broken. When they finally hung up, dawn was breaking again, and Pamela sat in her apartment staring at her phone, realizing she'd just had the best conversation of her life with someone whose face she'd never seen, whose life she barely knew, whose last name she didn't even have. Mike sat in his penthouse thinking the exact same thing, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt something that might have been happiness, or might have been terror, or might have been both. He called her back immediately. "I forgot to say good night," he said. She laughed, and the sound of it did something to his heart that felt like breaking and healing at the same time. "Good night, Mike." "Good night, Pamela." And neither of them hung up. They just sat there, breathing into their phones, connected by silence and something neither of them knew how to name yet. Chapter 2. The Voice That Became a Weapon and a Bridge. The phone calls became their new ritual, replacing the written words with something rawer and more dangerous. Pamela's voice carried textures the written word had hidden. There was the breathlessness she'd mentioned, yes, but also warmth that wrapped around Mike like sunlight through windows. When she laughed, really laughed, it sounded like freedom discovered after years of captivity. When she got passionate about a topic, her words tumbled over each other in a rush that made him smile even when he couldn't see her face. When she was tired, her voice softened into something vulnerable that made his chest tight, with the urge to protect what he couldn't reach through phone lines. Mike's voice held exhaustion like a familiar coat, something he wore so often he'd forgotten it was there. But sometimes, when he forgot to be careful, enthusiasm would break through the weariness. He'd get excited about an idea or a book she recommended or something she said that struck him as brilliant, and his voice would rise and quicken and sound almost young. Those moments made Pamela ache in ways she didn't fully understand, made her want to gather all his joy and keep it safe from whatever had taught him to hide it. They video-called next, carefully angled cameras showing only what they wanted seen. Pamela positioned herself so the frame caught her face and shoulders, her natural hair twisted into an elaborate style that had taken her an hour to perfect. Her apartment walls behind her were covered in bookshelves and framed poems, carefully curated to show intelligence without pretension. She never stood during calls, never shifted position in ways that would reveal too much, always had excuses ready about comfort or lighting or angle preferences if he asked why she stayed so still. Mike showed her his face properly for the first time, and she was struck by how handsome he was in a way that suggested he'd never had to think about it, had probably never leveraged it the way some people did with conventional attractiveness. Salt and pepper hair that was going grey too fast for someone his age, blue eyes that held intelligence and sadness in equal measure, a jawline that probably photographed well, but right now just looked tired. He wore expensive shirts without logos, sat in rooms with floor-to-ceiling windows that showed city views he never mentioned. Surrounded by success, he seemed to carry like a burden rather than a trophy. "You look exactly like I imagined," she said, which was a lie. She'd imagined someone softer, less striking, more accessible. This man looked like he belonged in magazines, not in late-night conversations with someone like her. "You're beautiful," he said, which was true but incomplete. Beautiful didn't capture the intelligence in her eyes, the strength in how she held herself. The way her smile suggested she knew more than she was saying, had survived more than she was showing. They fell into a pattern of nightly video calls that stretched into hours. They'd start talking around 9 or 10 in the evening and suddenly realize the sun was coming up. Time collapsing in the way it only does when you're with someone who makes you forget you're supposed to be keeping track of it. During one call, Pamela's nephew burst into frame, a 6-year-old bundle of energy asking her to come help him with something in the other room. Mike watched Pamela's face transform, watched her smile tighten at the edges like fabric pulled too tight, watched her hands grip the desk with sudden force that made her knuckles pale. "Uncle duties," she said lightly, her voice taking on a brightness that sounded performed. "Give me 2 minutes, sweetheart." She reached for something off-screen, and Mike heard wheels, metal against hardwood, the distinctive sound of a wheelchair moving across a floor. She left the frame carefully, never showing below her shoulders, moving the camera angle before she moved herself. She returned 5 minutes later, slightly breathless, slightly more guarded, a wall in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Mike didn't ask. Asking would shatter whatever careful balance they'd constructed, would force truths into a space that wasn't ready for them, would make her confront what she'd been carefully not saying. But he started noticing other things, how she never stood during their calls, not once. How she always had reasons why she couldn't move around her apartment while they talked, excuses about cords being too short or angles being wrong. How sometimes she winced when she thought he wasn't looking, pain crossing her face before she smoothed it away with practiced ease. The kind that comes from years of hiding discomfort. Pamela noticed his noticing. She saw his eyes track her movements or lack thereof. She saw the questions he swallowed, visible in how his mouth would open slightly and then close without sound. She saw the careful way he avoided certain topics, never asking her to stand up and show him her outfit, never suggesting video calls while walking around their respective spaces. And she was grateful and resentful in equal measure, grateful he didn't force the conversation, but resentful that the omission sat between them like furniture neither of them wanted to acknowledge, but both kept bumping into in the dark. "Tell me about your brother," she said one night, redirecting when the silence got too heavy with unspoken things. Mike's face changed completely, shifting from the careful pleasantness he usually wore to something raw. His name was David. He was my older brother, which meant he was everything first. First to ride a bike, first to drive, first to bring someone home for dinner, first to make my parents proud in ways they'd talk about to their friends. He was good at everything without trying, the kind of person teachers loved and parents bragged about at cocktail parties. What happened to him? A car accident? He was gone before anyone could process it was real. Some drunk driver ran a red light, and David was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, which is what everyone says when they mean there's no reason, no sense to be made of it. My parents never recovered. My mother especially. She turned his room into a shrine, kept everything exactly how he left it. His soccer trophies, his debate medals, his acceptance letters to colleges he never attended. I'd walk past his room every day and see this museum to perfection I could never match. This permanent exhibition of everything I wasn't. "That's cruel," Pamela said quietly, not softening it. "To you, I mean, to make you compete with a ghost, is it?" Maybe she was just grieving the only way she knew how. Grief doesn't excuse cruelty. You lost your brother too, but instead of getting a mother who saw you, you got a mother who wished you were someone else. That's not grief. That's abandonment with better publicity. Mike was quiet for a long time, his eyes focused somewhere past the camera. "No one's ever said that to me before?" Maybe no one wanted to see it. It's easier to excuse grief than to acknowledge what it destroys in the people left behind. They talked about David until dawn, about the ways death preserves people in amber while the living have to keep changing and failing and being imperfect. Mike told her about trying to join the debate team because David had loved debate, about failing spectacularly because he wasn't David and never would be, about discovering that trying to honor someone's memory by becoming them is just another form of dying. He talked about his mother's disappointment that felt like a physical weight, about his father who withdrew into silence rather than deal with his wife's grief, choosing absence over the mess of being present. "Your father's still alive?" Pamela asked. "Yeah, he divorced my mother eventually. Remarried someone kind and quiet who doesn't expect him to be anything he's not. We talk occasionally. It's cordial. He sends birthday cards. We have lunch twice a year where we discuss nothing important and part ways feeling like we accomplished something by being in the same room without conflict." "That's sad." "What is?" "That cordial is the best you can hope for with your father. That you've accepted crumbs and called it a meal? Mike laughed, but it sounded hollow. What about yours? You said he left. Pamela's turn to go quiet, to look somewhere past the camera at memories she'd rather not revisit. He left the day after I won a school poetry competition. I was 12. He sat through the whole ceremony, clapped when I received the award, told me he was proud of me, told me my poem about family was beautiful. Then we went home, he packed a bag and he walked out. Never came back, never called, never sent birthday cards or child support or explanations. Just disappeared like we were a story he got tired of reading halfway through. Did you ever find out why? Does it matter? The leaving is the only truth that counts. Everything else is just excuses dressed up as reasons. You don't believe that. I don't want to believe it. There's a difference between knowing something and being able to live with it. They sat with that distinction, both understanding how wanting and believing could exist in separate universes that never quite touched. Pamela's phone buzzed with a text from Rhonda, checking if she was okay, if she needed anything. The kind of protective surveillance her sisters had maintained since the accident, since the day everything changed and kept changing in ways none of them knew how to stop. Mike's phone stayed silent because no one checked on him unless they wanted something from him, unless there was a problem he needed to solve, or a decision he needed to make, or a crisis he needed to manage. I like talking to you, Mike said suddenly, the words coming out rushed, like he was afraid if he didn't say them quickly, he wouldn't say them at all. I like that you see through things instead of around them. I like that you don't pretend the world is better than it is just to make conversation easier. That's a kind way of saying I'm cynical and probably exhausting to be around. No, cynicism is easy. Anyone can be cynical. What you do is harder. You see clearly and you still choose to hope anyway. You acknowledge how broken everything is and you still show up. That takes real courage, the kind most people don't have. Pamela felt something crack open in her chest, something dangerous and terrifying and wonderful all at once. Mike? Yeah? I need to tell you something. This was it. This was the moment where she'd say the words and watch his face change, watch whatever they'd built together crumble under the weight of her reality. Her hands were shaking, her heart was performing arrhythmias, but she'd learned that the only thing worse than rejection was living in the fear of it, letting the possibility of no destroy the chance of yes. I need to tell you that I've never felt this way about anyone before, she said, which was true but also cowardice disguised as honesty. Confession masquerading as revelation, while hiding the real truth she wasn't ready to speak. And it scares me more than anything has scared me in a long time. It scares me too, Mike said. And his relief was visible, obvious in how his shoulders dropped and his face softened. And Pamela understood he'd been bracing for something else entirely, something worse than feelings. And she felt guilty for the relief he didn't know he shouldn't be feeling. They kept talking until the sun came up, neither of them ready to hang up, neither of them ready to face a day without the other's voice in their ear. And when they finally said goodbye, Pamela sat in her wheelchair and cried, not because she was sad, but because she was falling in love with someone who didn't know the most basic truth about her body. And every day that passed made the eventual revelation more devastating, the gap between what he knew and what was real growing wider, until she didn't know how to bridge it without destroying everything they'd built. Mike sat in his penthouse and wondered why Pamela never moved from that chair, and whether asking would break whatever magic they'd created, and whether he was ready to risk everything they had for answers that might change everything between them. Neither of them slept that day. They were both too busy thinking about what came next, about truth and timing, and whether love could survive reality. Chapter 3. The moment when everything breaks open. Mike asked to meet in person on a Tuesday morning via text message that read simply, I need to see you. Really see you. Please. Pamela stared at those words for 3 hours. Her phone screen went dark, and she'd wake it up again, rereading the same sentence, looking for hidden meanings or escape routes or anything that would make this easier. There was nothing. Just a man asking to meet the woman he'd been falling for, a completely reasonable request that felt like the end of the world. She spent the next 36 hours crying, not delicate tears that could be dabbed away with tissue and forgotten, but ugly sobbing that left her face swollen and her chest aching and her throat raw. She cried in her bed, in her bathroom, in front of her refrigerator at 3 in the morning, while eating ice cream she didn't taste. She cried like she hadn't cried since the accident, since the days when crying felt like the only thing her body could still do efficiently, the only response it had left to a world that had suddenly stopped making sense. Rhonda found her on the second day, door locked, lights off, apartment smelling like grief and unwashed hair. She used her emergency key to break in, prepared for catastrophe, finding instead her sister curled in bed surrounded by used tissues like some tragic artistic installation. "What happened?" Rhonda demanded, scanning the apartment for signs of disaster. "He wants to meet," Pamela said, her voice wrecked from crying and lack of sleep. "The forum guy? That's wonderful. Why are you falling apart?" "Because he doesn't know." "Know what?" "About this." Pamela gestured to her wheelchair positioned beside the bed, to her legs that didn't work the way legs were supposed to her entire reality that existed in the space between what she'd told Mike and what she'd carefully avoided saying. "He doesn't know any of it." Rhonda sat down hard on the couch, the weight of understanding making her legs give out. "You've been talking to this man for months, and you never told him." "How exactly does that conversation go, Rhonda?" "Hi, I really like you. Also, I'm paralyzed from the waist down. Hope that's not a deal breaker." "When do you say that? First message? 10th, 100th? After you've already fallen in love and the truth feels like a betrayal of everything you've built together. You say it before you fall in love with him. Too late for that. About 3 months too late." Rhonda was quiet for a long moment, processing what her sister wasn't saying directly, reading between the lines of what had been happening in these late-night conversations she'd been witnessing from the outside. "So tell him now, before you meet. Give him a chance to process it without you watching his face change, without you having to see whatever he can't help but feel in that first moment. And if he disappears, then he wasn't worth it anyway. Easy for you to say. You don't know what it's like to watch every single man's face change when they see this chair, to go from woman to wheelchair in their eyes in less than a second, to become a charity case or an inspiration or a burden, but never just a person they want, never just someone they desire without calculation, without moral complexity, without that split second where they're deciding if they're good enough people to look past this. So you're just going to keep lying?" "I haven't lied. I just haven't volunteered information that would have ended things before they began." "That's the same thing, and you know it. Omission is just slow-motion lying, and you've been doing it for months." They argued in circles for an hour, Rhonda insisting she tell him before meeting, Pamela insisting some things needed to be said in person where tone and context and physical presence could soften the blow, both of them knowing the real truth was that Pamela was terrified and there was no good option, only slightly less terrifying ones. Finally, exhausted and empty, Pamela texted Mike, "There's a cafe on Maple Street. Accessible entrance, Thursday afternoon. I'll be there early." She spent 2 days researching the location, making sure the entrance had proper ramps, that the bathroom was equipped correctly, that the tables were the right height, that she wouldn't have to ask for accommodations that would announce her disability before she was ready. She practiced what she'd say, how she'd position herself, whether she should tell him before he arrived or let him see first and explain after. She arrived 30 minutes early, positioned herself at a corner table where her wheelchair wasn't immediately visible from the entrance, and waited with her heart trying to escape her chest through her throat. Mike walked in, exactly on time, carrying yellow roses. Yellow for friendship, yellow for new beginnings, yellow because red felt too presumptuous and white felt too formal. His hands were shaking slightly as he scanned the room, and when he saw her, his entire face transformed into something she'd never seen directed at her before. Recognition and relief and hunger all at once, desire and nervousness and hope mixing into an expression that made her want to cry and laugh simultaneously. He crossed the cafe like he was afraid she might disappear if he moved too slowly, like she was a mirage that might evaporate if he didn't reach her quickly enough. "Pamela!" "Hi, Mike." He sat down across from her, set the roses on the table between them like an offering, and just stared. "You're real. I know that sounds stupid, but you're real and you're here, and you're even more beautiful than the screen showed. I was terrified you wouldn't come, that you'd change your mind, that I'd somehow imagined all of this, and you'd turn out to be someone completely different from who I thought you were." "You're very handsome," she said, which felt inadequate, but true. "And taller than I expected. People always look different in person, don't they? Like the camera flattens things out, makes everyone the same size." They fell into conversation easily, the awkwardness lasting maybe 30 seconds before they remembered how well they knew each other, how many hours they'd spent inside each other's thoughts. They talked about the drive over, the weather, the cafe's aesthetic choices, all the meaningless pleasantries that fill space before real conversation begins, before you can access the intimacy you've built over time. Then they talked about books they'd both read since last speaking, and a documentary he'd watched that made him think of her, and a poem she'd written that morning about anticipation and fear, and the way hope feels like both wings and weight. 4 hours evaporated like water in August heat. The cafe filled and emptied around them. Lunch rush turning into afternoon lull, turning into evening preparation, and neither of them noticed. The afternoon light changed from bright to golden to dim, painting everything amber, and they stayed frozen in their bubble of conversation. A waiter brought their check, and Mike reached for it automatically, muscle memory from years of always paying. "Let me get this. We can split it. Please, let me do this. Let me have this." She smiled, understanding he needed to perform care in the small ways available to him. "Okay, thank you." Mike stood, extending his hand to help her up in a gesture so automatic he didn't think about it, and time crystallized into before and after. Pamela wheeled back from the table, metal scraping against hardwood, the distinctive sound of a wheelchair in motion, and the entire cafe held its breath. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned. Mike's hand froze in mid-air, his face cycling through emotions too fast to name individually, but impossible not to recognize collectively. Surprise, recognition, recalibration, something that might have been pity or might have been concern, something that might have been fear or might have been uncertainty, something else entirely she couldn't identify but felt in her stomach like a punch. Then he lowered himself to both knees beside her chair, bringing himself to her eye level, and the gesture was so deliberate, so clearly thought through, that it almost hurt more than if he'd simply stood there staring. "I've been falling in love with your mind for months," he said, his voice steady, even though his hands betrayed him with trembling. "Your body is just the beautiful home it lives in." The words were perfect. The sentiment was exactly right. The delivery was kind and considerate, and exactly what any decent person would say in this moment. But Pamela saw what he didn't know she saw, what he didn't even know he'd shown. The microsecond hesitation before he knelt, the split-second calculation happening behind his eyes, the flash across his face that wasn't quite surprise because some part of him had suspected, had pieced together the clues she'd left scattered through their conversations, had prepared this response in advance for a possibility he'd been half expecting. Their eyes met and held, and in that moment they both understood something fundamental. He saw her seeing it. She saw him seeing her see it. They both knew something had been broken that wouldn't easily repair, that his words were true but incomplete, that her suspicion was justified but perhaps premature, that they were standing at a crossroads where every direction led somewhere difficult, Neither acknowledged this aloud. Some truths are too dangerous to speak in their first moments of existence. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice carrying weights he couldn't fully understand. "For what?" "Adieu for not running. For staying. For saying something kind instead of something true. It was true. Part of it was. The part about loving my mind. But your face told me the rest, before your mouth could catch up to cover it. Pamela, Don't explain or apologize or try to take it back. You can't help what you felt in that first second. No one can. I just need you to know that I saw it, and I'm going to carry it. And it's going to sit between us until we figure out what to do with it." Mike reached for her hands, held them in his like he was trying to prove something through pressure and warmth. "I'm not going anywhere. You say that now, but everyone does eventually. They see this chair and they recalculate everything. What they thought they wanted, what they think they can handle, whether they're good enough people to look past it, or whether that's even what looking past means. You're going to go home tonight and think about what this means for your life, and some part of you is going to wonder if it's worth it. That's not fair. You're putting thoughts in my head that aren't there. They're there. They're just not loud enough yet for you to hear them over your desire to be a good person." Mike wanted to argue, but couldn't find words that wouldn't sound like lies or promises he wasn't sure he could keep. So he just kissed her forehead, soft and careful, like she was something precious and breakable. And she felt the tenderness and resented it at the same time, hated that his first instinct was protection rather than desire. "I'll call you tomorrow," he said. "Will you?" "Yes, I promise. Don't make promises you're not sure you can keep. Just do it or don't. I'd rather have your honest silence than your guilty consistency." She wheeled into her building without looking back, and Mike sat in his car, watching her go, his hands still on the steering wheel, his mind racing through calculations he didn't want to be making, but couldn't seem to stop. He was wondering how wheelchairs worked in relationships, whether his penthouse was accessible, what accommodations would be needed, what his life would look like if this became permanent. He was wondering all of this and hating himself for wondering, for treating her like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. But the questions came anyway, because questions always come when reality arrives uninvited to replace fantasy. He called her that night at their usual time. They talked until dawn, about everything except what had happened in the cafe. Both of them clinging to the familiar pattern like drowning people cling to wreckage. Both of them knowing they were delaying something inevitable, but unable to stop themselves from postponing the collision they could already feel coming. Chapter 4. The Families Who Weaponize Love. Mike brought Pamela to his mother's estate 2 weeks later, believing transparency would make things easier. Believing if Dorothy just met her and saw who she really was, saw how brilliant and strong and incredible she was, that love would soften prejudice into acceptance. He was catastrophically wrong. Dorothy Burton's house sat behind gates that required codes and approval from security guards who looked like they'd been hired more for intimidation than actual protection. The estate sprawled across manicured lawns that looked spray-painted green, maintained by workers who arrived before dawn and left after dark, keeping everything perfect in ways that felt aggressive rather than beautiful. The architecture was modern and cold, all sharp angles and expensive materials arranged to impress visitors rather than welcome family. Mike had grown up in this house and never once felt at home, had always felt like a guest who might be asked to leave at any moment. Dorothy answered the door herself, which was unusual. She normally had staff for such things, people paid to buffer her from the minor inconveniences of daily living. She was dressed like she was attending a luncheon at an exclusive country club. Pearls and a designer dress and hair that had been professionally arranged into submission. Her smile was practiced and didn't reach her eyes, the kind of smile that serves as both greeting and warning. Those eyes landed on Pamela and widened slightly. First the wheelchair, processed and catalogued in less than a second. Then the skin tone, another piece of data filed away for future reference. The smile never wavered, but something behind it hardened into steel. "Mother, this is Pamela Bondi. Pamela, my mother, Dorothy Burton." "Mrs. Burton, it's lovely to meet you. Mike has told me so much about you." Pamela extended her hand, her voice warm and professional, determined to win this woman over through sheer force of charm. Dorothy took the offered hand briefly, her touch cool and quick and dismissive. "Please come in. Dinner is almost ready. I do hope you're not vegetarian or have any special dietary restrictions. I find accommodating too many preferences makes dinner parties unnecessarily complicated." She stepped aside to let them enter, speaking exclusively to Mike as though Pamela was furniture he'd wheeled in rather than a person requiring direct address. "Your sister Jennifer is already here. Thomas is running late from the hospital as usual. You know how he is about his schedule, always puts his patients before his family obligations." The house was exactly as cold inside as its exterior suggested, beautiful in the way museums are beautiful, designed to be admired rather than inhabited. Dorothy led them to a dining room with a table that could seat 12, currently set for 5, with crystal and china that looked like it cost more than Pamela's car. She directed Mike to one end of the table and immediately began discussing seating arrangements that would require Pamela to transfer from her wheelchair to a dining chair, a process that would require explanation and accommodation and attention. "Actually, I'm fine in my chair," Pamela said, her voice pleasant but firm. "If that's all right with you, Mrs. Burton." Dorothy's smile tightened like a drawstring pulled too hard. "Of course. Whatever makes you comfortable, dear. Though I must say, our dining chairs are quite expensive and very comfortable. But if you prefer, we can certainly work around your situation." The emphasis on situation was subtle but unmistakable, a verbal knife thrust with practiced precision. Jennifer arrived with hugs and questions, trying too hard to be welcoming in a way that made the effort visible and therefore insulting. "Pamela, Mike has told us so much about you. Well, not that much, you know how private he is, but enough that we're all very curious. How did you two meet? Was it online? I hear that's very popular now, though I could never do it myself. I'd be terrified the person wasn't who they said they were, that they'd turn out to be completely different from their profile." "We met through a poetry forum," Pamela said, ignoring the implied concern about authenticity. "We connected over writing first, which felt like a solid foundation." "Oh, how modern. You must tell me everything about your writing. Mike mentioned you're a poet. That must be so fulfilling, though I imagine quite difficult to make a living from. What do you do for income, if you don't mind me asking?" "Jennifer," Mike warned, his voice carrying an edge. "What? I'm just making conversation, Michael." "Pamela, you must think I'm terribly nosy, but I'm just interested in your life. It's so different from anything we're used to." Thomas arrived just as dinner was being served, still wearing scrubs from the hospital, apologizing for being late. He was the only one who spoke to Pamela like a normal human being, asking about her work and actually listening to the answers without visible calculation, discussing a book they'd both read, treating her disability as unremarkable as someone's height or hair color. Dorothy served dinner herself, despite having kitchen staff who could have done it, performing the role of gracious hostess while maintaining complete control of the conversation's direction. "Your father called yesterday, Michael. He wanted to know if you'd be attending his wife's birthday celebration next month. I told him you were very busy, though I'm not sure what you're so busy with these days, since you've stepped back from so much of your previous responsibilities." "I can speak to Dad directly, Mother. You don't need to relay messages." "Of course you can, darling. I was simply passing along information." He also mentioned that Amanda and her husband just bought a new house in the Hamptons. "Apparently it's quite lovely, featured in Architectural Digest. You remember Amanda, don't you, Pamela? Mike's first wife. Such a lovely woman from such a good family. We still see her occasionally at charity events. She and her husband are doing very well for themselves." Mike's jaw clenched so hard, Pamela heard his teeth grind. "Mother, can we talk about something else?" "What?" "I'm simply making conversation about mutual acquaintances." Amanda was here for dinner just recently with her husband. They brought lovely wine from their trip to Tuscany, and Catherine sent a Christmas card from Europe. She's teaching at a university there now, doing quite well. She always did have excellent taste in travel and education. Each reference was a small knife, carefully placed to inflict maximum damage while maintaining plausible deniability. Pamela watched Mike war with himself, his desire to defend her battling his lifetime of conditioning not to contradict his mother. Years of training that children don't raise their voices to parents, regardless of provocation. Dorothy continued her performance throughout dinner, mentioning her new charity for disabled children and how important it was to help those less fortunate, looking directly at Pamela like she was discussing a different species entirely. Like Pamela was an example of the people she helped rather than a guest at her table. "It must be so difficult," Dorothy said while serving dessert, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "living with such limitations. I admire your strength tremendously, truly. It takes such courage to face each day when things that come naturally to most people require such effort for you." "Thank you," Pamela said, her voice level and controlled, refusing to give Dorothy the satisfaction of visible anger. "Though I should mention I don't consider needing a wheelchair a limitation any more than you consider needing glasses one. It's simply how I navigate the world, no different than you using cars instead of walking everywhere or elevators instead of stairs." Dorothy's smile became sharp enough to draw blood. "Of course. I meant no offense. I'm simply acknowledging the obvious challenges you must face. It's admirable how well you cope with your condition. My condition has a name. It's called paraplegia, and I don't cope with it. I live with it. There's a difference. Of course, dear. Forgive my clumsy phrasing." As dessert was cleared and coffee served, Dorothy poured wine and turned to Mike with practiced concern. "Have you given any more thought to what we discussed last month? About seeing someone professionally? After everything with Catherine, I worry about your judgment. We all do. It's natural to want to help, to want to save people, but sometimes that impulse clouds our ability to see situations clearly." "My judgment is fine, Mother." "Is it? Because from where I'm sitting, you seem to be repeating patterns, choosing women who need things from you instead of women who can stand beside you as equals." The room went silent. Thomas set down his fork with a deliberate clink that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet. Jennifer stared at her plate like it contained ounces. Mike's face turned red, his hands clenching into fists on the table. "That's enough," Mike said quietly, his voice carrying more threat than shouting ever could. "I'm your mother. It's my job to be honest with you, even when it's uncomfortable. You've been hurt before, terribly, and I won't stand by and watch it happen again. Even if the circumstances are different this time, even if the needs are different, the pattern is the same. You're trying to save someone instead of loving someone, trying to prove something to yourself or to me or to the world, instead of actually building a partnership with an equal." Pamela felt like she'd been slapped, the breath knocked out of her lungs. She wanted to respond, to defend herself, to say something that would match the cruelty with equal force. But her voice felt trapped behind her ribs, stuck in her throat, and she realized this was Dorothy's strategy, to render her silent through sheer audacity, to say things so outrageous that response became impossible. Mike stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against expensive flooring. "We're leaving now. Don't be dramatic, Michael. Sit down and finish your coffee. We're having a family discussion. No, we're having you attack my girlfriend under the guise of concern. And we're done. Pamela, let's go." He looked at her and she nodded, and they left without another word. Mike pushed her chair with more force than necessary, his fury vibrating through his hands into the metal frame, his whole body rigid with anger. They drove in silence for the first 10 minutes, Mike's hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, his jaw still clenched, his breathing harsh. Finally, Pamela spoke. "Your mother is terrified. That's not an excuse for what she said. I didn't say it was. But fear makes people cruel in ways love never could. She's not attacking me because of who I am. She's attacking me because of what I represent to her. I'm proof that you're making choices she doesn't control, living a life she doesn't recognize, choosing happiness over her approval. And that terrifies her more than my wheelchair ever could. So what do? You decide what matters more. Her approval or our relationship, because you can't have both. She's made that very clear. Mike pulled over to the side of the road, turned off the engine, and looked at her. I choose you. Every time, every way, I choose you. You say that now. But choosing me means losing her, maybe forever, and I don't know if you're ready for that cost. Family is complicated, and cutting someone off is easier to say than to do. I've been losing her my whole life. Maybe it's time to stop pretending otherwise. Stop hoping she'll suddenly become someone she's never been. They sat in the parked car and talked until midnight about families and loyalty and the difference between honoring your parents and being destroyed by them, about love and obligation and where one ends and the other begins. And when Mike finally drove Pamela home, they both understood they'd crossed a line that made everything more real and more fragile at the same time. Pamela's own family proved equally complicated when she brought Mike to her mother's house for dinner. Gloria saw his expensive car parked in their modest neighborhood, saw his designer clothes that probably cost more than her monthly salary, saw his entire presentation, and her face closed like a door slamming shut against winter cold. The dinner was tense and full of challenges barely disguised as questions. Rhonda asked pointed questions about his intentions, his past relationships, why a wealthy man would want her sister. Nicole, bitter from her own recent divorce, suggested he was slumming in their world, looking for someone who wouldn't demand too much, because society had already told her she was lucky to get anything. Gloria remained polite but cold, treating Mike like a threat rather than a guest, like someone who'd come to take something precious rather than offer something valuable. Only Grandmother Louise looked at Mike and Pamela together and saw something real beyond the obvious complications. After everyone left and the house was quiet again, she pulled Pamela aside to the porch where they used to sit together in summer, shelling peas and talking about life. "That boy loves you," Louise said without preamble. "I can see it plain as day, clear as glass. Everyone else seems to see something different. That's because everyone else is looking with fear instead of faith. Your mother sees a man who might leave like your father did, who might take your heart and disappear with it. Your sisters see a man who might hurt you like that fool Terence did, who might destroy what's left of your ability to trust. But I see a man who's terrified he's not good enough for you, and that's a fear worth respecting because it means he knows your value." What if they're right, though? What if this all falls apart and I'm left more broken than I started? Then it falls apart and you survive, just like you've survived everything else life has thrown at you. But don't kill this beautiful thing before it has a chance to live, just because you're scared of the ending. Everything ends eventually, child. The question isn't whether it will end, but whether it was worth having while it lasted. Pamela sat with her grandmother's words long after Louise had gone inside to sleep, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one like stars descending to earth, thinking about fear and faith and which one she wanted to guide her choices moving forward. Chapter 5: The Past That Arrives in Headlines. The headline appeared on a Tuesday morning while Pamela was drinking coffee and trying to write "Billionaire's Latest Charity Case. Mike Burton's surprising new romance after 2 failed marriages." The world tilted sideways. Pamela's hand shook as she scrolled through the article, reading words that felt like they'd been designed specifically to destroy her. There were photos of them leaving the cafe, entering his car, arriving at her apartment. Professional photos taken by someone who'd been following them, watching them, turning their private moments into public spectacle. The article dissected Mike's past marriages with surgical precision. It included interviews with his ex-wives, quotes that had obviously been taken out of context or perhaps spoken in moments of anger and never meant for publication. Amanda was featured prominently. Mike was never really present. He was always working, always building something, always chasing the next achievement, like it would finally fill whatever hole he was trying to fill. I felt like a trophy he'd won and then forgot about on a shelf. The affair was wrong, I know that now, but I was drowning in loneliness, and he never even noticed I was underwater. Catherine's quotes were sharper, more deliberately cruel. He's controlling without meaning to be, which is the worst kind of controlling. Everything has to be perfect, everything has to follow his plan. He couldn't handle when life got messy or when I had needs he didn't anticipate. He wanted a wife who existed on his schedule, who needed exactly what he was prepared to give, and nothing more. I couldn't live like that. Nobody could. Then the article turned its attention to Pamela, and the cruelty became explicit and unavoidable. It questioned her motives, suggested she was using her disability to manipulate a lonely, wealthy man seeking redemption through charity. It compared her to other questionable partners of billionaires in a sidebar that made her stomach turn, implying, without quite stating directly, that she was a gold digger with better publicity than most. The comment section was worse, strangers speculating about their relationship in ways that made her feel violated. People discussed her wheelchair, her capabilities, whether the relationship could possibly be physical, whether Mike was having some kind of breakdown, or if this was a fetish. Every cruel thought people usually kept private had been typed out and displayed for the world to read. And Pamela felt each comment like a physical blow. She was reading the same horrible paragraph for the 5th time when her phone rang. Mike. Have you seen it? Yes. I'm coming over. Okay. He arrived within an hour, looking like he hadn't slept in days, his hair uncombed and his eyes red. They sat in her small living room while he told her everything he should have told her months ago, all the details he'd omitted from previous conversations, all the pain he'd tried to leave in the past, but that had just been waiting for the right moment to resurface. He told her about Amanda's affair in detail that made Pamela's chest ache, how it had lasted years, happening in their home, in their bed, with his supposed best friend who'd been part of their wedding party. How he'd come home early one afternoon to surprise her and found them together. The shock of it so complete, he'd actually apologized for interrupting before his brain caught up to what his eyes were seeing. They were planning their future while living off my money and my friendship, Mike said, his voice hollow. When I confronted them later, after the initial shock wore off, Amanda actually said she'd been trying to tell me for months, but I was never around to listen. Like somehow her betrayal was my fault for working too much, for not noticing she was unhappy, for not reading her mind and fixing problems she never told me existed. Then he told her about Catherine, and this story was somehow worse because the cruelty was more calculated. The deliberate pregnancy conceived as insurance against abandonment. The secret termination, when his financial situation temporarily shifted. Finding the clinic receipts in her purse while searching for his keys. Her admission, delivered without apparent guilt, that she'd never wanted children with him specifically. Just the security of his name and money. She told me I was impossible to love, Mike said quietly, staring at his hands. That I demanded perfection while being fundamentally flawed myself. That anyone who stayed with me would eventually realize they were tolerating me rather than loving me. That I was the kind of person people endured, out of obligation or benefit, but never actually enjoyed being around. Pamela listened to his destruction and felt her own secrets, burning through her chest like acid. My turn, she said, understanding that honesty demanded reciprocity. She told him about Terence in detail she'd never shared with anyone except therapists and lawyers, about the party where she'd begged him not to drink, where she'd offered to drive multiple times, where he'd called her controlling and paranoid and said she was embarrassing him in front of his friends, about the crash, the moment of impact she barely remembered, followed by the hospital awakening she'd never forget. The realization that she couldn't feel her legs, and the doctor's face telling her the damage was permanent. He sued my family, Pamela said, her voice shaking with rage that hadn't diminished over years. His lawyer convinced a judge that my arguing had caused him to lose focus, that my behavior in the car had created the dangerous situation. He took the only money my mother had saved, money she was going to use for my medical bills and modifications to make the house accessible. And then, while I was still in physical therapy, learning to transfer from bed to wheelchair, learning to catheterize myself, learning to live in a body that no longer followed my commands, he married someone else. Someone who could walk down the aisle to him. Does he still bother you? I have a restraining order. He violates it occasionally with accidental encounters at places he knows I frequent. My lawyer says, unless he threatens me directly or touches me, there's nothing more we can do. The law protects people who are smart enough to make their harassment look coincidental. Mike's hands clenched into fists. If he shows up again, you call me immediately. I can handle him. I know you can. But you shouldn't have to. You've already survived him once. You shouldn't have to keep surviving him over and over. They sat together in shared pain, two people carrying wounds that had never properly healed, that had just scabbed over enough to be ignored most of the time. They made promises to trust each other completely, to face the world together, to never let other people's cruelty poison what they were building. The article is wrong about you, Mike said. About us. You're not using me. You're not a charity case. You're the first real thing in my life, in longer than I can remember. The first person who makes me want to be present instead of always reaching for the next thing. The article is wrong about you, too, Pamela replied. You're not emotionally unavailable. You're just careful about who gets to see the real you. And that's not the same thing as being closed off. That's called having healthy boundaries after being betrayed by people who should have protected you. They held each other until the afternoon light faded to evening, until Rhonda texted asking if Pamela was okay, until Mike's phone buzzed with messages from his brother and sister and people who'd seen the article and had opinions about it. They held each other and pretended the world couldn't reach them here, in this small apartment where the outside noise became distant and manageable. But that night, alone in their separate spaces, they both lay awake, thinking about their ex's words. Mike wondered if maybe Amanda and Catherine had been right, if maybe he was fundamentally unlovable, too damaged to maintain healthy relationships, destined to drive away anyone who got close enough to see his flaws clearly. Pamela wondered if maybe the article had a point, if maybe she was unconsciously using her disability to make Mike feel needed. If maybe she was repeating patterns she couldn't see because they were too close to her face. Neither of them shared these doubts. They texted goodnight like always, said I love you like always, and privately carried fears that felt too ugly and too honest to speak aloud. The next morning, Dorothy called Mike. I saw the article. This is exactly what I was afraid of. That woman is going to destroy your reputation, and you're too blinded by whatever misguided sense of obligation this is to see it happening. Goodbye, Mother. Don't you dare hang up on me. I'm trying to protect you from yourself, from making decisions you'll regret once this infatuation wears off and you're left dealing with the consequences. No, you're trying to control me. There's a difference between protection and control, and you've never learned where one ends and the other begins. He hung up. Dorothy didn't call back, but she did something worse. She began calling Mike's business associates, his old friends, anyone who would listen, spreading carefully worded concerns about his judgment and mental state. Within a week, Mike started getting worried calls from people asking if he was okay, if he needed help, if they should be concerned about recent changes in his behavior. The world was closing in from all directions, and neither Mike nor Pamela knew how to fight an enemy that came disguised as concern, camouflaged as care, wrapped in the language of love while dealing damage that felt anything but loving. Chapter 6. The Breaking Point where love reveals its limits. Everything fell apart over 3 weeks that felt like 3 years, compressed into nightmare time. Mike's former partner launched a coordinated campaign to acquire his holdings, using every legal trick and personal connection accumulated over decades to destabilize what Mike had built. The attacks came from every direction simultaneously. Board meetings that stretched past midnight, arguing over decisions that should have been straightforward, lawyers calling at dawn with new crises requiring immediate attention, financial analysts questioning his competence in carefully worded reports that got leaked to media outlets, shareholders demanding explanations for choices that had been sound until someone started spreading doubt. Mike started sleeping at his office, not because he wanted to, but because going home meant admitting defeat, and admitting defeat meant acknowledging he was failing at everything simultaneously: his work, his relationship, his life, his ability to hold anything together. The leather couch in his office became more familiar than his bed. He showered in the executive bathroom. He kept spare clothes in his desk drawer. He became a ghost, haunting his own life. He missed dinner with Pamela, then another, then a third. His apologies became routine. His promises to do better became hollow. His presence, even when physically there became absence in another form. He'd sit across from her at restaurants, checking his phone every 30 seconds, his mind calculating problems she couldn't see. His attention fragmented across 17 different crises, his eyes looking at her, but not actually seeing her. "You're not here," Pamela said during what had become their almost nightly fight. "Physically present, but mentally absent. You're a hologram of yourself." "I'm right in front of you." "No, you're in your head solving problems I can't help you with, fighting battles you won't let me see. I'm just the woman sitting across from where you used to be. That's not fair. You know what I'm dealing with. I know you're dealing with it alone instead of letting me in. I know you're using work as an excuse to avoid everything else, including us. I know you're disappearing into crisis because crisis is easier than intimacy." Mike's exhaustion manifested as anger, his control finally snapping under the pressure of maintaining too many fronts simultaneously. "What do you want me to do? Ignore everything falling apart so we can have romantic dinners and pretend the world isn't on fire? Pretend I'm not on the verge of losing everything I've built? I want you to let me stand in the fire with you instead of acting like I'm just another thing you have to manage. I want you to stop treating me like I'm fragile, like I need protection from your reality. I'm not asking you to fix everything. I'm asking you to let me see it. You don't understand the pressure I'm under." "You're right. I don't, because you won't fucking tell me. You just disappear into your office and your phone calls and your meetings, and I'm supposed to what? Wait patiently? Be understanding? Pretend this isn't killing us slowly?" They fought like this constantly, circular arguments that resolved nothing, each conversation ending with apologies that felt increasingly meaningless because nothing actually changed after them. Mike promised to be more present. Pamela promised to be more patient. Neither of them kept these promises because promises require intention and energy, and they were both running on fumes and desperation. Then came the argument that broke everything beyond immediate repair. It started over something small, the way ending arguments always do. Pamela forgot to text Mike back for several hours because she'd been writing and her phone was in another room. When Mike finally reached her, his worry had curdled into accusation. His fear had transformed into anger. "Where were you? I called 3 times. I texted half a dozen times. I was writing. My phone was in the other room. It's not a crisis. I was worried. Anything could have happened. I'm not a child who needs constant supervision, and you're not checking on me because you're worried. You're checking on me because controlling my location is easier than dealing with your actual feelings. That's not what this is." Then what is it? Because it feels like you're treating me like another problem to solve, another responsibility to monitor, another thing on your endless list of concerns. I'm not your employee or your project. I'm supposed to be your partner. The fight escalated from there, both of them saying things they meant in the moment but would regret later, both of them too tired and too hurt to pull their punches. Mike's exhaustion made him cruel in ways he'd never been cruel before. Maybe everyone was right from the start. Maybe I'm too damaged for this. Maybe you deserve someone who isn't constantly fighting wars, someone who can actually be present, instead of just promising to show up eventually when things calm down. Dean. Pamela heard all the things he wasn't saying directly. She heard that she was a burden, that their relationship was another obligation on his endless list, that maybe her wheelchair was an extra complication he didn't have energy for when everything else was already falling apart. Her response was ice carved into sentences, every word chosen for maximum impact. You think you're the only one fighting? I battle my own body every single day while people like your mother look at me like I'm half a person. But I chose you. Anyway, knowing exactly what that choice would cost, knowing your world would never fully accept me. If you're giving up, at least have the courage to say it plainly, instead of hiding behind this performative concern for what I deserve. Tell me you don't want this anymore. Stop making it about me deserving better, and admit you want easier. Mike left that night and didn't come back. For 8 days, that felt like 8 years. They didn't speak. The silence grew teeth and claws, each day making reconciliation harder, each hour adding weight to words that couldn't be unsaid, each minute creating distance that felt increasingly impossible to cross. Dorothy seized the opportunity like a predator, recognizing wounded prey. She arrived at Pamela's apartment uninvited one afternoon, somehow charming her way past the building's security with the confidence that comes from a lifetime of getting what she wants through sheer force of entitlement. "We need to talk," Dorothy said, not asking permission, just walking in like she owned the space. Dorothy sat on Pamela's second-hand couch like it might contaminate her expensive clothes, arranged her designer purse just so, and smiled that practiced smile that carried no warmth, no genuine emotion, just calculated strategy. "I'll be direct because I respect you enough for honesty, even if my son doesn't. I'm prepared to offer you a substantial sum if you'll end this relationship with Michael. $250,000. Enough to cover years of medical expenses, enough to pursue your writing without financial stress, enough to start fresh somewhere his name won't follow you like a shadow." Pamela stared at her, momentarily stunned into silence. "You're trying to pay me to leave him. I'm trying to save both of you from inevitable heartbreak that anyone with experience can see coming. Michael has been destroyed by failed relationships before. I watched Catherine break him so completely, I wasn't sure he'd survive it, wasn't sure he'd ever trust anyone again. And now here you are, and he's falling apart again. And I will not watch my son destroy himself, trying to be someone he's not equipped to be. What he's not. Do someone equipped to handle your needs long-term. Michael is a good man with a generous heart, but he's already carrying too much. Eventually, inevitably, the extra weight of your situation will become too much, and he'll resent you for it, even though he'll hate himself for the resentment. And you'll both end up hating each other, staying together out of guilt or obligation while the love turns toxic. I'm offering you a chance to leave with dignity and financial security before it gets that ugly, before you're both damaged beyond repair." Pamela felt something cold settle in her chest, something hard and angry and clear. "And you think money makes this dignified?" "No, I think reality makes this necessary. Both of Michael's previous wives were sophisticated women who understood his world, who came from similar backgrounds, who knew what they were getting into, and even they couldn't make it work. You're a lovely person, truly, but you deserve someone better suited to your circumstances. Someone who won't eventually tire of accommodations. Someone whose family won't always see you as the woman who wasn't enough. Someone who can meet you where you are, instead of requiring you to constantly stretch toward where they are. Dorothy stood, pulled out a business card with account numbers written on the back in elegant script. The offer stands for 1 week. After that, you're on your own when this inevitably falls apart. I'm giving you an escape route. Most people don't get that gift. I suggest you take it. After Dorothy left, Pamela sat in perfect stillness for an hour, staring at that business card, feeling rage and humiliation war inside her chest. Then she remembered her phone had been recording the entire conversation, and she saved the file with shaking hands. When Mike finally called that night, exhausted and apologetic, ready to try again, Pamela played him the recording without preamble. Mike listened to his mother's voice dissect their relationship with clinical precision, reduce love to transaction, frame his happiness as a phase that needed ending for his own good. His face cycled through disbelief to rage, to something that looked like grief for the mother he'd always wanted but never actually had. "I need to go," he said quietly when the recording ended. He drove to the family estate, and the confrontation that followed became legendary among the household staff. They would later describe shouting that shook the windows, the sound of something expensive and irreplaceable shattering, words so harsh and honest they made listeners uncomfortable even in retrospect. Mike said things he'd been swallowing for years. Things about his brother's death and his mother's cruelty and the impossible standards she'd used to destroy his confidence systematically since childhood. Dorothy said things too, things about disappointment and ungrateful children, and how everything she'd done had been for his own good, even if he was too blind to see it. She threatened to cut him off completely, to spread rumors about his mental state, to make his life as difficult as she could make it if he continued down this path. Mike told her to do her worst. He said he was done seeking approval from someone incapable of giving it, done trying to earn love from someone who saw affection as currency to be withheld for control. He left without looking back, and Dorothy was already on the phone before his car cleared the gates, beginning her campaign of concerned whispers to anyone who would listen. Mike returned to Pamela's apartment at dawn, his eyes red from crying or anger or both, his voice hoarse from shouting, and told her everything. They held each other and made promises they weren't sure they could keep, and both of them felt the foundation shifting beneath them like ground before an earthquake, unstable and terrifying and maybe already too damaged to support what they were trying to build on top of. In Chapter 7, The Conspiracy That Targets Strength itself, the publishing offer arrived via email on a Wednesday morning with a subject line that made Pamela's heart stop mid-beat. Book deal offer. Morrison House Publishing. Immediate response appreciated. The message was professional and flattering, explaining that an editor had discovered her work through various online forums and was impressed enough to bypass the usual submission process entirely. They were offering a contract directly. The advance was $60,000, more money than Pamela had ever seen in one place, enough to change everything about her daily survival. The terms looked standard to her untrained eye. It represented everything Pamela had fought for during 10 years of writing and rejection, validation she'd stopped believing would ever come. She was already mentally spending the money, calculating what she could fix and pay off and finally afford. When Thomas called unexpectedly, "Don't sign anything," he said, without preamble or greeting. "Whatever Morrison House sent you, don't sign it." "How did you even know about the offer?" "My ex-wife works in publishing. She heard about it through back channels and called me immediately." "Pamela, it's a trap. A really sophisticated, really cruel trap." Thomas explained the whole scheme in detail that made Pamela's stomach drop. Morrison House was a subsidiary of a larger corporation owned by Mike's rival, the same person trying to destroy Mike's holdings. They'd researched Pamela's submission history, identified her as Mike's vulnerability, and crafted an offer designed to be irresistible. The plan was elegant in its cruelty. Publish her book with minimal editing, Market her exclusively as Mike Burton's girlfriend, rather than as a writer with her own merit. Use her disability as a publicity angle. Then remainder the book after 6 months and drop her with a failed author label that would destroy future opportunities with legitimate publishers. There are clauses buried in that contract, Thomas said, his voice urgent, that give them rights to your story, including your relationship with Mike. They can authorize biographies, documentaries, tell-all articles, anything they want, and you'd have no control. They're not trying to publish you. They're trying to buy the rights to destroy Mike through you, using your own words and experiences as weapons. After hanging up, Pamela sat with the contract for hours, seeing how close she'd come to signing, how desperately she'd wanted it to be real. She felt humiliated by her own hunger for validation, ashamed that she'd almost walked into such an obvious trap, furious that someone had weaponized her dreams against the man she loved. When she told Mike that evening, expecting support and maybe relief that she'd discovered the truth in time, he became furious, not at his rival but at her. His reaction came from exhaustion and fear, but landed like betrayal. How could you even consider it? His voice was sharp enough to draw blood. How could you not immediately see what this was? Because I wanted it to be real. Because I've been rejected so many times that an acceptance felt like validation I'd earned. You're smarter than that. You should have known better. You should have been more careful. Known what exactly? That anyone offering me success must have ulterior motives? That my work couldn't possibly be good enough to attract genuine interest? That I should assume every opportunity is manipulation? If that's not what I meant, then what did you mean? Because it sounds like you're saying, I should have assumed from the start that I'm not good enough, that any opportunity coming my way must be a trick. It sounds like you're blaming me for hoping, for wanting something I've worked toward for 10 years. Mike's exhaustion made him cruel in ways that would haunt him later. I thought you were stronger than this. I thought you knew your worth without needing strangers to validate it. I thought you were smarter than to fall for something so obviously designed to manipulate you. Something in Pamela snapped, years of accumulated hurt finally breaking through her controlled exterior. You have no idea what you're talking about. You have no concept of what it's like to be me. You were born into wealth and opportunity and access. Even your struggles came with safety nets most people never get, with resources to fall back on when things got difficult. You've never been rejected 47 times. You've never had doors close in your face because people see your body before your talent, because they decide what you're capable of based on what you look like rather than what you've produced. I faced plenty of rejection in my life. No, you've faced setbacks. There's a massive difference. Rejection is when the world tells you that you fundamentally don't belong, that there's no space for someone like you, that you should stop trying because the answer will always be no, regardless of quality or effort. You've never experienced that level of systematic dismissal, so don't you dare stand there in your expensive clothes, in your expensive life, judging me for being vulnerable to manipulation. Don't you dare judge me for wanting something that felt like a yes after years of hearing no. I'm not judging you. You absolutely are. You're standing there judging me for not being skeptical enough, for not being cynical enough, for hoping that maybe someone actually saw value in my work. You're judging me for being human and desperate and tired of fighting alone. Then she told him things she'd been hiding, things about her financial reality that shame had kept locked away. She told him about freelance work that barely covered rent, about how some months she chose between groceries and pain medication because she couldn't afford both. She told him about Rhonda secretly paying her utilities when the shut-off notices came, about her wheelchair needing expensive repairs she'd been postponing for months because the cost was impossible. She told him about stretching her pain medication by taking half doses and living with breakthrough pain because her insurance barely covered anything and the out-of-pocket costs were crushing. You offer me love, but you don't see my reality, she said, her voice breaking with accumulated exhaustion and frustration. You want me to be invulnerable while you're allowed to crumble under pressure. You want me to reject opportunities that could change my life because they might complicate yours. You want me to be strong enough to carry both of us while you fall apart, but not human enough to need support myself. Our relationship is drowning not in our challenges, but in your inability to let me be flawed and struggling and occasionally desperate. That's not fair. That's not what I want at all, isn't it? You fell in love with the woman I performed in our messages, the one who was strong and poetic and philosophical about pain. But you're horrified by the woman I actually am. The one who needs help opening jars some days. The one who can't afford medication that would make her functional. The one who has to choose between physical therapy and groceries. Who has to calculate whether she can afford the accessible taxi or if she needs to skip therapy this week to pay rent. You're putting words in my mouth. No, I'm saying what you won't admit. You don't trust me. You never have. You're terrified I'll choose someone else's offer over you, that maybe your mother was right, that maybe I'm with you because of what you can provide rather than who you are. Every time I need something, you're calculating whether it proves I'm using you. Every time I accept help, you're wondering if it's manipulation. You love the idea of me, but you can't handle the reality. That's not true. That's not how I feel. Then prove it. Tell me right now, honestly, that you don't wonder even a little bit, even in the back of your mind, where you don't want to acknowledge it, whether I'm with you because you're you or because you're wealthy and I'm struggling and desperate enough to settle. Mike opened his mouth to respond immediately, to deny it completely, but something made him pause. The hesitation was brief, less than a second, barely noticeable, but Pamela saw it, and that microscopic pause said more than any words could have. That's what I thought, Pamela said quietly, something dying in her voice. She packed a bag that night while he watched, neither of them able to find words that would fix what had broken. She told him she needed space to remember who she was before she started measuring her worth against his fears, before she started seeing herself through his doubts, before she started performing strength instead of living honestly. I'll be at my mother's house, she said. Don't call unless you have something real to say. Don't text unless you figured out what you actually want from me, from this, from us. Mike didn't fight it. He couldn't. He watched her leave, his silence proving her point more effectively than any argument could have. After she was gone, after her presence had left only absence behind, he sat in her apartment until dawn, surrounded by evidence of her life, understanding with terrible clarity that he'd just lost the best thing that had ever happened to him, because he couldn't trust that something good could be real and unconditional. Pamela returned to her childhood home and cried in her old bedroom, and her mother held her without asking questions, and Rhonda made tea. Nobody drank, and Grandmother Louise said nothing at all, because sometimes the only comfort is presence without expectation, space without pressure, silence without judgment. Chapter 8. The Reckoning That Reshapes Souls Separately. Pamela found the research trial information while scrolling through medical journals at 3 a.m, unable to sleep in her childhood bed. The program was based in Switzerland, combining stem cell therapy with experimental nerve regeneration techniques in ways that previous approaches hadn't attempted. They accepted 12 patients annually from thousands of worldwide applicants, selecting based on injury type, time since injury, and various medical factors. Success rates were modest, but real. 42% of previous participants regained some sensation, 26% regained limited mobility, 8% saw significant functional improvement. The cost was $370,000, not covered by any insurance. The process required 6 months on site in Switzerland, with intensive daily therapy and significant risk of complications, including infection, additional nerve damage, or complete loss of remaining sensation. Gloria wanted her to apply immediately, without hesitation. "We'll mortgage the house, take out loans, do whatever it takes. This is why I've been working all these years, saving every penny I could. This is exactly what that money is for. I'm not destroying your financial security on a maybe, on a 42% chance that I might feel something, and a 26% chance I might move a little, and an 8% chance that anything actually changes meaningfully. You're my daughter. That's what the security is for. That's the whole point of having it." Rhonda researched every published study from the program, created detailed spreadsheets of outcomes and risks and demographic factors, built hope-like architecture around Pamela's uncertainty. She calculated odds, analyzed success stories, tried to turn miracles into mathematics that felt manageable. Nicole warned it might be another medical promise that led nowhere, another procedure that cost everything emotionally and financially and changed nothing physically. She'd watched Pamela go through too many treatments that failed, too many therapies that promised progress and delivered disappointment, and she couldn't bear to watch her sister hope again and break again. Pamela sat with the decision for 3 weeks. She was terrified of hoping because hope had betrayed her before with other treatments, other procedures, other promises of improvement that never materialized. Previous doctors had suggested therapies that did nothing, surgeries that changed nothing, treatments that cost everything and delivered nothing. But she was more terrified of not trying, of looking back in 10 years and wondering what if, of spending her life questioning whether she'd given up too easily on possibility. She didn't tell Mike. This decision needed to be entirely hers, without his money contaminating her agency, without his influence turning her choice into something he provided rather than something she claimed for herself. She applied to the trial using money she'd saved from every freelance job for the past 3 years. Money she'd been accumulating for no specific purpose except proof that she could save it, proof that she had resources of her own. She was accepted into the program based on her specific injury type, her age, her overall health, and her demonstrated commitment to physical therapy over the years since her accident. The acceptance letter felt like validation and terror in equal measure. She still didn't tell Mike. Meanwhile, Mike's situation reached its brutal climax. The takeover attempt failed when Mike outmaneuvered his rival with a strategy that cost him dearly. He sold major portions of his holdings to a private equity firm that would change everything he'd built, accepting terms that left him wealthy but no longer in control, choosing survival over pride. The victory was hollow, ashes in his mouth, because he won the battle and realized he'd been fighting the wrong war entirely. His therapist, whom he'd started seeing after Pamela left, finally admitting he needed help he couldn't provide himself, asked him a question that changed everything. What do you actually want from life? Not what you're supposed to want, not what would make your mother finally approve, not what would prove something to your ex-wives or your dead brother or anyone else. What would make you happy at a cellular level? Mike broke completely in that session, sobbing for the first time since his brother's funeral, crying in ways he'd never allowed himself to cry because men in his world didn't crumble. He admitted he wanted Pamela, wanted children, wanted a small house with a garden where he could grow vegetables and tomatoes and watch things grow without spreadsheets or projections. He wanted to wake up next to someone who challenged him, frustrated him, made him better by refusing to accept his worst self. Someone who saw through his defenses and loved him anyway. Then why aren't you fighting for that? His therapist asked. Mike admitted he didn't know if he deserved it, didn't know if he was capable of being what Pamela needed, didn't know if his damage was fixable or permanent, didn't trust that good things could happen to him without conditions or eventual betrayal. Over the next 6 weeks, Mike restructured his entire life. He sold his penthouse with its city views and emotional emptiness. He donated most of his furniture to charity. He moved into a modest 3-bedroom house with a yard that needed work, in a neighborhood where people didn't know his last name or his net worth. He began learning to cook actual food instead of ordering from restaurants where staff knew his preferences. He started attending support groups for adult children of narcissistic parents, sitting in church basements with strangers who understood wounds that looked different but felt the same. He slowly built a life that wasn't performance, that wasn't about proving anything. That was just about being human without apology. He showed up at Gloria's house at dawn on a Saturday, unshaven and exhausted, wearing jeans and a t-shirt instead of his usual expensive clothes. He looked like someone who'd been through something transformative and destructive simultaneously. He asked if Pamela would speak with him. She met him on the porch where she used to play as a child, where her grandmother used to shell peas and tell stories. For the first time since they met, they were both completely honest, without self-protection or performance. Mike told her about the therapy, the business changes, the house, his realization that wealth without purpose is poverty in expensive clothes. He admitted he was wrong to judge her for considering the publishing deal, that his fear had masqueraded as concern, that he had no right to demand she be stronger than he was capable of being himself. Pamela told him about the treatment trial, her terror of hoping, her need to make this decision independently of his influence or his money. She told him she was leaving for Switzerland in 2 weeks, that she'd be gone for 6 months minimum, that she didn't know who she'd be when she returned. Mike's response was the first thing he'd gotten completely right in months. "I'll support whatever you choose, financially if you'll accept that support, emotionally, regardless of your choice. But the decision is entirely yours, and I'll love you the same whether you try the treatment or not. Whether it works or fails, whether you walk or wheel for the rest of your life." "You mean that?" "I do. I've spent months in therapy figuring out what I actually feel versus what I think I'm supposed to feel. And what I feel is love for you exactly as you are. Not contingent on your body changing, not dependent on you being easier or different or more convenient for my life." They didn't reconcile immediately because too much damage lived between them. Too many words that couldn't be unsaid, too many wounds that needed more than apologies to heal. Instead, they began again from a more honest foundation, meeting for coffee twice a week, talking without assumption, rebuilding from ashes rather than trying to resurrect what had burned. Pamela left for Switzerland alone, declining Mike's offer to come with her. She needed to do this as herself, not as half of a couple. Not with someone watching and worrying and trying to protect her from pain she needed to experience alone. Chapter 9. The Silence Before Transformation, Where Everything Changes. The first 3 months in Switzerland were agony beyond anything Pamela had imagined pain could be. The program included 8 other patients from around the world, and they became her family in ways civilians never could. They understood the specific hell of hoping your body might betray you less, the exhaustion of fighting yourself daily, the complicated grief of mourning abilities you might regain, which meant acknowledging you'd lost them in ways you'd been denying for years. Intensive physical therapy consumed 6 hours daily, pushing her body past limits she didn't know existed. Experimental procedures left her screaming into pillows at night, her body revolting against the invasion of needles and electricity and manipulation. Pain management barely managed pain, just took the edge off suffering that felt designed specifically to break her. Small improvements appeared and then disappeared in devastating cycles. She'd regained sensation in her left foot for 3 days, enough to feel temperature and pressure, enough to hope. Then it would vanish overnight, and she'd wake up back where she started, back to nothing, back to the familiar emptiness of her legs. Mike honored her request for space, but sent letters, actual handwritten letters on real paper every week. He told her about his garden, about the tomatoes he was growing from seeds, about therapy sessions where he finally discussed his brother's death and his mother's cruelty. He told her about the conversation he had with his father for the first time in years, actually talking instead of just exchanging pleasantries. He didn't ask about her progress, didn't request updates on her treatment. simply shared his life and told her he loved her regardless of outcomes. Pamela kept every letter in a folder she read during the hardest nights when pain made sleep impossible and hope felt like cruelty. During her 4th month, everything went catastrophically wrong. An experimental nerve stimulation procedure caused her body to reject part of the treatment with violence that terrified her medical team. Her blood pressure plummeted dangerously. Her kidneys began failing. Her temperature spiked to dangerous levels. For 11 hours, doctors fought to stabilize her while she drifted in and out of consciousness, hallucinating conversations with her father who'd abandoned her, with Terence who'd destroyed her, with a version of herself that never got in that car, that lived a completely different life. Mike received the emergency call from Rhonda, who'd somehow gotten his new number, her voice shaking with panic. He was on a plane within an hour, calling Thomas, who cancelled surgeries and booked his own flight. They arrived to find Pamela in intensive care, connected to machines that breathed for her and monitored every function and kept her alive through sheer technological will. Mike sat in the waiting room for 16 hours while doctors worked. He didn't eat, didn't sleep, just sat and prayed to a God he didn't believe in, making bargains he knew didn't work that way, promising everything if she just survived. When Pamela woke, fragile and connected to machines that beeped rhythmically, she found Mike asleep in a chair he'd clearly occupied for days. His hand was reaching toward her bed even in sleep, his face unshaven and exhausted, his clothes wrinkled from being worn too long. She didn't wake him immediately. She studied his face, memorizing the new lines, the additional gray, the vulnerability sleep revealed. She understood with absolute clarity that she loved him, not despite his flaws, but including them, that his imperfection matched hers in complementary ways that made sense only to them. She also understood she'd nearly died chasing mobility, and she needed to examine whether she'd been running toward ability or running from acceptance of her body as it was. When Mike woke, their conversation was different from any previous. Quieter, more essential, stripped of performance. "I realized something while you were in surgery," Mike said. "I don't give a fuck whether you walk. I love the woman in the wheelchair because that's who you are, who you've been becoming since your accident. My hesitation in the cafe wasn't doubt about you. It was fear of my own inadequacy, terror that I wouldn't be enough for your needs, that I'd fail you the way I'd failed everyone else. I've spent 4 years proving I don't need help," Pamela replied, "and 2 months in Switzerland learning that accepting help isn't weakness, that independence and interdependence aren't contradictory, that maybe love is allowing someone to care for you without keeping score, without tallying debts, without measuring who owes what to whom." They didn't make promises or plans. They just held hands while machines beeped and nurses came and went, and the world continued outside their small bubble of present moment. Pamela completed the treatment protocol after 6 months. The results were modest but meaningful. She regained significant sensation in her legs, more than doctors had predicted. She could stand with support for periods up to 20 minutes, enough to transfer more easily, enough to feel less dependent on her chair for every small movement. She experienced less chronic pain, her body rebelling less constantly against itself. She wasn't cured. She'd never be cured. She'd always need her wheelchair for distance and difficult days. She had limitations that remained limitations. But the real victory was accepting that improvement didn't require transformation, that her worth never depended on her body's cooperation, that she was enough exactly as she was, while still being allowed to want different. She returned home to find Mike waiting at the airport with Rhonda, Gloria, and grandmother Louise. He didn't make a scene, didn't run to her with balloons and proclamations and performance. He simply walked beside her chair and asked how she was feeling, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than anxious concern. "I'm tired," she said. "Scared, hopeful, uncertain, and ready." Ready for what? Ready to try again, this time with more honesty and less fear. This time knowing exactly what we're both bringing to this. damage and all. Chapter 10. The Wedding That Rewrote Endings into Beginnings. Mike proposed 6 weeks after Pamela returned, not with fanfare but with intention. He chose the anniversary of their first cafe meeting, reserving their table permanently under both their names. When Pamela wheeled in, she found him already seated, waiting. He didn't stand. He stayed seated, bringing himself to her eye level naturally, and reached for her hands. The ring was custom designed, based on a poem she'd written years before they met, a piece about unbreakable threads connecting people across distance and time. He'd found it in her old notebooks and memorized it, had it translated into design by a jeweler who specialized in meaningful rather than flashy. "Will you marry me?" he asked simply. Then added, "Will you build a life where both our wounds can heal, where failure is acceptable and perfection is abandoned, where we choose each other daily even when it's difficult, even when it would be easier to quit, where we fight together instead of against each other?" Pamela said yes immediately, then said, "Wait, I have conditions. I want a prenuptial agreement that protects both of us, that ensures I'm never questioned as a gold digger, that secures my financial independence regardless of marriage outcome. I want it specified what happens if we divorce, because pretending divorce is impossible makes the same mistake twice." Mike agreed before she finished explaining, relieved she was practical enough to demand protection. They each hired separate attorneys who made the agreement ironclad and fair. Dorothy asked to meet Pamela privately before the wedding. They met at the rehabilitation center where Dorothy was doing physical therapy after her stroke, both women in wheelchairs temporarily, humbled by their body's rebellion. "I was cruel," Dorothy said without preamble. "Fear made me say things love never would have. I'm not asking forgiveness because I haven't earned it. I'm asking for a chance to do better, to learn, to try." Pamela didn't forgive immediately. "Respect is mandatory. Warmth will develop naturally or not at all. I won't perform gratitude for basic decency. Your actions will show me what your words claim." Dorothy respected this boundary more than she'd respected anything else Pamela had said. The wedding was intentional rather than traditional. They married in Grandmother Louise's church, where she'd married 53 years ago, where she'd buried sons, where she'd prayed through decades of systematic oppression. The ceremony was fully accessible, designed so every guest could participate equally. Pamela wore a dress that accommodated her chair, stunning and elegant, custom-made by a designer who understood beauty should serve bodies. Mike wore a simple suit without expensive flourishes. The day was about promises, not performance. Thomas stood as best man, Rhonda as maid of honor. Their toasts mentioned vulnerability as strength, watching their siblings learn to be human as more impressive than any achievement. Dorothy attended, stood when Pamela wheeled down the aisle to Aretha Franklin, her face showing something that might be pride or regret or acceptance. The vows were personal, specific to their actual relationship. Mike vowed to listen when Pamela said she needed help and when she said she didn't, to build a life accommodating her reality rather than expecting her to contort into his world. Pamela vowed to let him support her without interpreting support as pity, to share struggles instead of weaponizing independence, to challenge him when he fell into old patterns. Mike announced the Pamela Bondi Foundation for Writers with Disabilities during the reception, a publishing initiative that paid competitive advances and marketed books based on quality rather than inspiration narratives. 7 books were in production. Pamela's novel would launch the series. He also announced he'd stepped back from business operations entirely, that Thomas would lead, that he was prioritizing living over legacy. Grandmother Louise pulled them aside before they left. "Marriage is the beginning, not the ending. The world will test you constantly, but I see something rare in you both. The willingness to be fully known, fully flawed, fully human together. That willingness is worth more than perfection." As they drove away, Pamela leaned against Mike's shoulder. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking about everyone who said I'd never find love. About 47 rejection letters. About Terence and my father and strangers who saw my wheelchair before my humanity. About how I almost believed them, almost accepted that half-life. What changed? Nothing changed except I met someone who saw the whole story, not just the tragic chapter. Who loved my mind first and discovered my body was just a strong, scarred, beautiful home it lived in. Someone broken too, who understood surviving doesn't mean forgetting, that healing isn't linear. She added with the strength that first attracted him, but I would have been fine without you too. I built a life I loved before you arrived. That's why this works. I don't need you to be complete. I want you because choosing you makes my already complete life better. Mike pulled over, turned off the engine, and kissed her in a way that suggested beginnings rather than endings. Decades of choosing each other, two whole people walking parallel paths that occasionally intersected in breathtaking beauty. 5 years later, Pamela published her 4th novel, while Mike harvested tomatoes from their garden. 10 years later, they adopted 2 children who needed parents brave enough to see past diagnoses. 20 years later, Dorothy lived in their guest house, braiding her granddaughter's hair. 30 years later, they renewed vows in the same church. Pamela still in her wheelchair, Mike's hair white, both bearing scars from battles fought together. But on their wedding night, they simply drove toward New Zealand. 2 people who learned the greatest love stories aren't about fixing each other, but about choosing each other, exactly as they are. Every single day, they married not because they completed each other, but because they were already whole. 2 powerful souls who chose to walk parallel paths that occasionally intersected in moments of breathtaking beauty, proving that the greatest love stories aren't about becoming one, but about remaining two while building something bigger than both.